Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you to Eric and the Mystic and Noack Library for hosting Why Native Plants tonight. My name is Tim Wachtman, and I'm from Plantscapes of New England, which is a not-for-profit social business that works on ecological restoration, as well as promoting native plants in the landscape. I'm first going to go to the Plantscapes website, because I think there might be some information there, that resources that you could find useful. So this is the Plantscapes homepage located at plantscapesne.com. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's some information on my background, what Plantscapes does, and also why I think it matters so much, which I'll be going into a little bit in the talk. There's a link to Plantscapes events, which shows the seminars that are upcoming, including the Planting for Native Pollinators on April 14th and Enjoying Your Native Landscape on April 28th, both of those with the Mystic and Noack Library. And at the bottom of the page, there's several links. There are tips, which I've put up for my clients, but you're welcome to explore those as well. And the last one is to notes. And if you follow the notes link, it'll take you to a list of presentations. And if you look up Why Native Plants and click on notes, it will take you to my speaker notes for this presentation. So you don't have to worry too much about catching all the books or the websites or the plants that I talk about. Everything's listed in the speaker notes, and I'll leave these up probably for a couple weeks after the talk, and you can peruse those at your convenience or even download them if you want to. All right, and with that, I'll go back to my slides. Alrighty, lost my apologize. I've lost my cursor. Okay, what are we doing here? Try new share again. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'll start with a definition of native plant. And my version of the definition takes into account both history and biology. From a historical standpoint, a native plant is a plant that has not been introduced by humans, so it's naturally occurring in the local environment. And from a biological standpoint, it's a plant that has an established ecological role in that local environment. We can also talk about near natives, which are plants that are native, that are close to the, are native plants that are close to the local environment, or could be predicted to be moving into the local environment due to something like climate change. An example of that is the 9-bark flower here that the red admiral is nectaring on. That's actually not a plant that's native to our local environment here in New London County, but it is present in other parts of Connecticut. So that is a plant that I would consider to be a near native and wouldn't have any qualms about bringing that into the local environment. I also have some exceptions to the native rule that I talk about, which may be introduced species, but they have high interest and they support native wildlife in a number of ways. And they're also not known to be or suspected to be invasive, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, the most authoritative source for determining what's native and what's not that's out there at the moment is BONAP, which stands for the Biota of North America program, which is located in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And what they've done is taken all the plants that occur across the United States and have categorized them as being native or non-native to a local area down to the county level. So in the background picture here, there's an Asclepias tuberosa, or butterfly flower, which is covered with one of my favorite butterflies, by the way, which is a spice bush swallowtail. But the Asclepias in the BONAP map that I have here is a local native. It's present naturally in New London County and throughout Connecticut, and that's indicated by the light green in the map. Over in Rhode Island next to us, this plant is not well established as a native, so that's given a yellow indication. And if you go further north of us into southern Vermont and New Hampshire, this plant was present at one time, but it's now been extirpated or lost from those areas. So BONAP is a very powerful tool if you're looking to get more information on where plants are natively located around the area. It's the most up-to-date resource that's available at this time. And you can't really talk about native plants without talking about invasives. So invasives are non-native species that have been introduced by human activity, and they have a detrimental effect on the local ecosystem. They're harmful either to the environment or the economy or health, perhaps. And this can be contrasted with native species, which may be aggressive or noxious, something like poison ivy, for example. But poison ivy is not an invasive plant. It's a native plant here. A lot of our local species depend on it. But the real problems for our local ecosystem are these invasive plants. And in this slide, I show 5 of them that are very common, and they're some of the most difficult ones to eradicate. Up in the upper left is burning bush euonymus, and we have oriental bittersweet, barberry, Japanese knotweed, and Norway maple. And what's common about invasives are that because they grow so aggressively, they displace the native species from the environment. And what that leads to is biodiversity loss, because things like insects and birds and higher organisms depend on those native species for their their food supply and habitat and to complete their life cycles. So as the invasive species displace the natives, we're losing more and more of our other native species over time. As I said, these plants are characterized by a very aggressive growth pattern, but they also are very good at proliferating and spreading their seeds. So it's very much an ongoing effort and quite a nuisance to keep these invasive species under control and remove them from our landscapes. And unfortunately, some of these are still popping up in nurseries as well for sale. So if you see those, do try to avoid them because they cause some really serious problems in the landscape. And it's also important to keep in mind that what today is maybe a very fashionable exotic, tomorrow we may discover that it's an invasive species, which is why I'm going to argue for focusing on native plants in your landscapes. There are a number of resources out there to learn more about invasive species. At the level of the whole United States, and I've linked all of these in the notes. There's the Invasive Plant Atlas, which gives the most comprehensive information about all the invasive species across the country. Connecticut also has a version, our own invasive plant list. A lot of very good information there as well. The Penn State Extension program has some excellent information sheets on a lot of the invasive species that are also present in our area, including information on best practices for removing them. And one of the best places to start is a brochure that's put out by the Connecticut River Conservation called Invasive Plants in Your Backyard. This has really good pictures and descriptions and information on how to control the invasive species that are most common in Connecticut. Okay, so why do I think this is so important? This is a page from the Plantscapes website, and it lists a number of resources that have been published recently detailing the extinction crisis that we're in the midst of. So I encourage you to look at some of these articles to really understand the depth of the situation that we're in at the moment. At the top of the list, though, I'll put a plug in for David Attenborough's latest documentary. It's called A Life on Our Planet, and it's available on Netflix. It's a great chronicle of the changes that have taken place in the last century. Most of that's not a very positive story, but he spends a good part of the last of the documentary with a very hopeful message showing that it's not too late and that there's a lot as individuals that we can do to turn things around. So I encourage you to take a look at that. If you don't have a Netflix account, it's worth doing their trial service for a month just to watch that video, I think. Okay, so I mentioned that we're in the midst of an extinction crisis. And just to give you a few of the facts on that, in terms of invasive species, there's been a 70% increase in their abundance over the last 50 years. Insect populations have been plummeting. They've declined by 45% in the last 40 years. And there's been somewhere in the neighborhood of a 3 billion, a loss of 300 billion birds over the last 50 years, which is a 30% reduction. And all those things are linked because the native species, the native plants that are being displaced are fundamental to the functioning of all the rest of the ecosystem. If the native plants are going away, then the pollinators that depend on those are not going to be able to complete their life cycle. And then the birds that require those insects, especially the butterfly and moth larvae, those birds aren't going to have the food sources that they need to perpetuate their species. And the three most important factors in that biodiversity loss are habitat destruction, primarily due to sprawling development, as well as overuse of pesticides, and finally climate change. Now, there are things that we can do about this on an individual level, and I've listed 4 of the most important here. At the top of the list is, to the extent that we can, to convert lawn into habitat. In the upper left here, there's a beautiful home, very traditional landscaping here. It's predominantly turf grass, which has its place in certain functions. If you need a play area, or you want to create a nice path or a border with some turf grass, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that at all. But if you have a large expanse of lawn and all you're doing is mowing that every week and watching it grow, that's really not providing any benefit ecologically, and it's really a net negative for the environment, considering all of the inputs that go into maintaining that lawn. The second thing that I would encourage people to think about is putting more native plants into their landscapes. And this can be done in any kind of situation, whether it's a dense urban or suburban location, or whether it's in a more rural environment where there's more space available. Or even if you're an apartment dweller or in a condo and just have a balcony or a patio, you can put native plants into containers and at least support the pollinators that will be visiting those. The third thing that we need to think about is reducing pesticides and herbicides. These are having a devastating effect on insect abundance. And as I mentioned, that just has tremendous downstream effects to other organisms in the ecosystem. And the one type of pesticide that you really want to watch out for are the systemic pesticides that are taken up in the plant and are presented to pollinators and such in the pollen and nectar, and have been shown to have a very detrimental effect on insects. And finally, I'll just mention reducing light pollution. This is something that affects the moth population in particular, but it also affects other insects as well. If you have to use outside lighting, please consider putting it on a motion detection system so that they only come on when they're needed, and that will be a big benefit to especially the moth populations. Okay, since this is a library audience, I do like to mention some books here and there. Bringing Nature Home is a book by Doug Tallamy that was published many years ago now, but it was a book that really inspired me to think more deeply about native plants and their role in our environment. And a couple of the things that he talks about in this book, one concept is keystone species. And keystone species are organisms that have an outsized role in supporting other species in the ecosystem. So a lot of other animals are dependent on them to complete their life cycle. And one of the best tools for exploring this keystone concept is called the Native Plant Finder from the National Wildlife Federation. And this was actually produced in collaboration with Doug Tallamy's lab. So it's science-based and has a lot of really valuable information in it. And it's also very easy to use. You just plug in your zip code. And after you plug in your zip code, just click on Find Native Plants, and it'll bring up lists of both flowers as well as trees and shrubs that have the highest ecological value for your local area. And for example here, the first flower that comes up is goldenrod, which supports 123 different types of butterflies and moths. And this list is in rank order by how many species are supported by those plants. And if you look at oak trees down here, an amazing 470 species at least are supported by our native oak trees. And as you can see, there's other things like trees in the cherry family and willows and maples that also have very high ecological value. But this is a great resource for exploring that keystone concept. The other thing that Tallamy talks a lot about is specialist host species. So for example, the beggar moth only has 3 main types of plants that it can use to complete its life cycle, primarily things that its larvae can use as food sources. So if these plants are not available in the environment, this moth is not going to be able to perpetuate itself because it's not going to have the food that its larvae need. So this is also something that you can pull out of the Native Plant Finder, is the types of plants that you can think about bringing into your environment to support particular moths or butterflies that have a more restricted diet. Okay, so that's my main concern with native plants, is the biodiversity question. Something that I like to think of as life with a capital L. But there are many other benefits to putting native plants in your landscape. And I'll talk about a few of those in the next slides. First of all, native plants require a lot fewer inputs for us to take care of them. And by transitioning from a traditional landscape to a more ecologically based landscape, we can greatly reduce the amount of mowing that's necessary, the amount of watering that we do, and weeding. We can also pretty much eliminate putting in things like dead mulches and pesticides and herbicides. And if we're paying closer attention to selecting and siting plants properly, we can also remove the need to fertilize the plants, because they'll be growing in a place that's naturally conducive to their growth without putting all of these inputs in. And another advantage of native plants, as you can see in the background here, if the terrain is not conducive to mowing or maintaining, native plants will be perfectly happy to fill in those niches and provide us with a lot less maintenance to do to take care of that landscape. One of the other things I'll talk about is that by putting native plants in your landscape, you don't have to sacrifice the aesthetics at all. As examples of that, if you've got a woodland path or a cottage garden or a more formal garden, or if you want to put in a mini meadow or a pocket prairie, or as in the background here, if you want to put in a pollinator garden retreat, there's a native plant that is adapted to fill any sort of available niche in the New England environment. You just have to find the right plant for the right place. Okay, and the last thing that I consider a huge benefit of native landscapes is our ability to enjoy them. And once people start adding native plants, I encourage them to visit their landscape as often as they can. And that's going out throughout the day and throughout the year, because one characteristic of native landscapes is that they're very dynamic. They're always changing. Things are always coming and going. And as you add more and more natives, you're going to invite in a lot of organisms that you've never seen before. So I encourage you to visit often. Also, you can certify your landscape. There are a number of organizations that do this. The National Wildlife Federation has a good program that can provide you with signs as well, signage for your gardens to let your neighbors know, or maybe community officials or passerby, that what you're doing there is very intentional and it's very beneficial and important, and it will help to spread the message of moving towards a more ecologically responsible mindset. If you bring these new plants in, you're going to make a lot of new friends as well. Things like this tachinid fly that's hanging out on a mountain mint flower. I think this guy is very cute with his spiky hairdo, but he's also got a fascinating life cycle. And he's if you're a vegetable gardener, he's a very beneficial parasitoid that will take care of a lot of the pest issues in your vegetable garden as well. I encourage people, as they're learning more about their native landscape, to take notes. You can do this in a paper journal, but there's also a lot of tools out there now, like iNaturalist and others, that will help you document what you're seeing in your landscape and help you figure out what's there as well by getting help from other people. As well as reading, there's a lot of books out there that have been available for decades, but also there's new ones coming out all the time. So there's just tons of things to learn about the environments that we're trying to support. And finally, I'll mention all the citizen science projects that are out there. Academic research labs figured out a long time ago that if they bring the public in to help them do their work, we can be their eyes and ears and funnel in a massive amount of data that they wouldn't be able to collect otherwise on their own. So there are many, many opportunities to get involved in efforts like that. So what I hope you're getting a picture of is a reframing of how we think about our landscapes, and that we can go from a traditional view like this to something more like this. And in so doing, provide a lot of benefits to ourselves as well as the other species that are around us. And just to recap, this sort of environment provides so much more ecological value in terms of biodiversity, but also the practical benefits of reducing the amount of inputs and time that we need to put into maintaining our landscapes. The aesthetic potential that native plants provide, as well as the much higher degree of interest that they put into a landscape, and all the opportunities for enjoyment and engagement they provide. And I'll just say here as well that everyone has a role in this, no matter where you live or how large your property size is. Whether you're able to put in a lot of plants or just a few, every contribution counts. And by moving in this direction, we'll just create a more sustainable, thriving planet. And that's something that I think we should all care deeply about. So I hope I've convinced you to, if you're not doing it already, to see how many different native plants you can think about putting into your landscape, and to start going out and acquiring those plants. And in the next few slides, I'll try and provide you with some tools and sources for selecting those plants, and give you some tips on places where you can look for them. So the good news is that a lot of the big horticultural growers have become aware that there's a growing trend of interest in native plants. So they've started producing these now and marketing them, which is a great thing. It's great to see these in the nurseries. One thing to be aware of, though, especially if you're looking at say a big box store that sources things more nationally, some of the plants that you find there may be North American or US natives, but they may not be native to your local area. So it it pays to do some research to make sure that the plants that you're interested in are actually native to the, or near native to the local area. Another thing to keep an eye out for is that a lot of the plants that are marketed are called nativars or selections or selected varieties. And what will tip you off to those is you'll see a variety name in quotes. And this indicates that it's not a naturally occurring species. This is either a hybrid or a plant that's been selected by humans for horticultural purposes, which could mean floral characteristics or foliage characteristics, which are attractive to humans in different ways, but may reduce its ecological value. So an example would be a variety of flower that has multiple, like a double petals, for example, or a flower color or flower size that the native pollinators are not going to recognize, or the flowers may not even have very good amounts of pollen or nectar in them, or they may not be accessible to the pollinators. Or there may be foliage that, because of its shape or its different color, it's no longer attractive or useful to the caterpillars that would normally feed on that plant. So these are a couple things to watch out for when you're shopping for plants. And also, it's really important today to ask your nursery folks if the plants that they're supplying you have been treated in any way with pesticides, especially the systemic pesticides, because the last thing you want to do is bring home a plant from the nursery that's going to be a death trap for the pollinators that you're trying so hard to support. So just keep that in mind as well as you're out and about sourcing your native plants. Okay, so a long-standing mantra in the horticultural field has been right plant, right place. And the idea behind this is that if you are careful about matching up your plant selection to the type of conditions that you're putting it in, that plant's going to do a lot better and it's going to require a lot less maintenance. So some of the things you want to keep in mind are the soil type that you're putting it into, especially the pH of that soil, the light that's available to the plant. Some plants will require direct sun nearly all day long, whereas others won't tolerate that amount of sunlight, and they'll do much better in a shady condition. Available moisture levels are very important, and you also want to consider how that plant is going to grow, especially if it's a tree or a shrub. You don't want to put a tree that's going to get very large underneath power lines, or perhaps you don't want it overhanging your house eventually. So make sure you take those things into consideration before you put in a plant. Also, some native plants, if you put them into a traditional landscape where they're getting more fertilization or more water than they normally would, they can spread more readily, they can grow bigger, they can flop over because they've grown too large. and they can bully the other plants that are around them. So be careful that with a native plant, you may not want to pamper it too much because it may not fit in with the other plants that are around it based on the conditions that you're putting it in. And finally, it's important to think about the function of that plant. Using tools like the Native Plant Finder will help you to understand more about its ecological role. But also, if you're in a neighborhood where there's predominantly oak trees around, you may not want to plant another oak tree. Think about putting in some pines or shrubs that will attract a greater variety of organisms to that location and increase the local biodiversity. And finally, one of the key plant selection criteria that's important for this area is whether that plant's going to be attracted to deer or not, and also rabbits to some extent. But deer have become, again, a real problem in this area because given our human population density here, there just aren't enough top predators, natural top predators, and there probably won't be that can help to control the deer population. So the deer in many areas have stripped all of the native vegetation out of the landscape. And so as you're selecting your plants and siting them, it's a good idea to take into account whether those plants are deer resistant or tolerant to deer browsing, whether they can stand to be munched on a few times and still bounce back again. And I think it's also not a good thing to encourage the deer population by feeding them, and also to support local population management efforts. Because again, in the sort of highly developed environment that we've created here, deer have, while being a native species, because they are so aggressive at stripping out the vegetation, they're really becoming a detriment to biodiversity itself in our type of environment. So another thing that's of great help in selecting plants for our local region here are some search tools that are available. And there's two that I like particularly that I've linked to in the notes. One's from the Native Plant Trust. It's their Garden Plant Finder. And the other one is from North Creek Nursery, their plant search tool. The one I show here is the Garden Plant Finder from the Native Plant Trust. And all you do is put in your search criteria, whether you're looking for a tree or a shrub or grass, the type of growth conditions that the plant will be going into, and it will provide you with a list of plants that are appropriate for those conditions, and it will give you a lot of information on how to grow those plants and what sort of wildlife those selections will support. So this is a great tool. It's very easy to use. And it's available on the Native Plant Trust website. The Native Plant Trust used to be called the New England Wildflower Society. They changed their name a year or two ago. The Native Plant Trust is really the best source of information for native plants throughout New England. They do a lot of really good research, and up in Framingham, Mass, they have a site called Garden in the Woods, which is their headquarters. It's about a half hour west of Boston, but it's definitely worth a day trip if you're interested in native plants. There's all sorts of microenvironments there. It's a very diverse landscape. So you can see a huge number of native plants in the environments that they most like to grow in, and also the companion plants that work well with them. So just walking through their trails, you get so many ideas about different plant combinations that you can put together. And they also have a nursery on site that specializes in native plants. And the Native Plant Trust also has a nursery and production farm in Whately, Mass, which is a little bit further west in West Central Mass. The other place that I'll mention is North Creek Nurseries. It focuses more on perennial plants, but they have a very good search tool and have a very large selection of perennial plants that are appropriate for the New England region. Both of these groups have been working with native plants for a long time, and I think they do a great job of providing support to people who are interested in native plants. Okay, so I think I'm getting to the end of my time and the end of my slides. So I'll thank you for your attention. Before I go, I'll just mention at the bottom of the Plantscapes homepage, there's a feedback button. If you have any comments on the presentation, I'm always appreciative of those. Also, if you have any questions that weren't answered tonight, feel free to submit those to the feedback form as well, and I'll try to get an answer back to you as soon as possible.